Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction and also for inviting me. I'm very pleased for being part of this Smart Winter School. It's a pity that I'm here, not there with all of you. So hopefully we will have other occasions soon for meeting and discussion in person. But it's a great occasion for me to share with you some of the activities we are doing in the lab, in particular in the Bioinspired soft robotics. I would like also to share with you some of the new projects and the idea that we have for next generation soft robots. So I would like to start actually with our approach to this field that is, as you probably know, deeply based on bioinspiration. So our idea is, in fact, to take inspiration from living organisms, from their features, and then translate these functionalities into specification to design and develop robots that are able to operate in real environment in very unstructured condition. Sometimes since these platforms are deeply based on the bioinspiration, as I mentioned, we can use these robots also for validating hypotheses on the system, so on the biological system that we take as a model. So our goal, our ambition is also to use robotics for science. So, and I will show you a couple examples of this approach for science. In particular, our model are soft animals, in particular, specifically cephalopods, but also earthworms, snails, and so on, but also plants. And in terms of applications, we developed these robots, as I said, in particular for very complex environments, so for industry, specifically for manipulation grasping, but also for moving and acting in very extreme environment, and also for monitoring and precision agriculture. These are the main domain in terms of application. But why we want to take inspiration, in fact, from living organisms? So as we know, natural organisms are not perfect at all, so are imperfect systems. They implement a solution that are in particular the results of a natural selection. And features like flexibility and plasticity are very important, are crucial for all the living organisms to survive. So, and this is in fact the features that we analyze in our living organism. But in particular, what is very interesting also from a robotics point of view is their capability to adapt in a very, as I mentioned, dynamically changing condition. And the adaptation can be also considered as a form of intelligence and a key to survive. So the way in which they survive is exactly what we want to implement in our robot. But at the same time, it's not only a matter of, we can say, of adaptation, because there are some missing terms in the science of form. In particular, very important is the concept of adaptation that was recently, quite recently, introduced by Stephen Gould and Elizabeth Vreba. With exactly this concept. So what we use usually is the word adaptation as a feature that is directly crafted for a current utility by natural selection. But there are other important aspects that we have to consider when we take inspiration from nature, that is this concept of adaptation, that is a feature that in fact is co-opted for a current utility, following an origin for a different function or not function at all. I will give you some example of this adaptation concept. In particular, one of the very famous example is the panda animal, the panda bear. That is a very interesting example of imperfect but innovative solution. In fact, as you know, this animal has a particular diet because they eat only bamboo, but they don't have, if you give a look at the panda hand, this is not, designed to hold and to manipulate bamboo. And this is exactly an example of adaptation, functional cooptation, since the panda uses, in fact, a false dump that is an enlarged waist bone to grasp, to manipulate the bamboo. So it's not a result of an adaptation, so a result of natural selection, but is an example of adaptation, functional cooptation, as I mentioned. Another example that is very interesting and in some ways related to us is the presence of sutures in the skull of mammals. So we no doubt that these are very useful for parturition and to reduce the pain during this act. But in fact, these skull sutures are also present in the birds and reptiles, which have, in fact, only to escape from a broken egg. And this concept was also mentioned by Charles Darwin in The Original Species, exactly has an important aspect of not of adaptation, but as a concept of adaptation, in which it's very important to analyze such functionality because not all are derived by a natural selection. Why is so important? Because when we take inspiration, as I mentioned, from living organisms, it's very important to consider the fact that it's not true that each part performs a function, but we need to carefully analyze which kind of part are relevant to imitate a functionality also in our robot. So the approach is, in fact, not to copy nature, but instead try to understand first and then simplify such a functionality in a design of new robots. So our vision is exactly to take inspiration from this living system to develop, as I mentioned, robots that can operate in such kind of environment, very unstructured condition and dynamically changing situation. This is why we are considering natural organism as a great model for developing new robots. And in particular, as I mentioned, our models are both soft animals and plants. And in particular, today, I would like to mention some results about plants, in particular, how we are developing growing robots, but also climbing robots that take inspiration from climbing plants, soft body robots, and a new actuator based on osmosis. I would like to start with the concept of soft body robots. In particular, mention our model, one of the most investigated model, as you know, in soft robotics is the Octopus animal. We started some years ago to investigate the anatomy and the control, the nervous system of this animal that is quite peculiar. First of all, the structure of the animal are muscular hydrostatic, so the volume remains constant during the contraction, the muscle. But what is very interesting in this animal is that octopus doesn't have any rigid skeleton, a rigid structure, so it can squeeze the body, also in very narrow environment. It can bend the arm in any point, in any direction. And also they use suckers to explore the environment and manipulate objects. But very interesting also from a robotics point of view is their distributed control. So most of the neurons of this animal are in a brain, but in addition, most of the neurons are in the arm. So there is an important peripheral nervous system and also ganglia dedicated to the suckers. So they can explore and manipulate object, most of the movement are controlled directly by the peripheral nervous system. So why is it also relevant in robotics? Because when the morphology increases in terms of complexity, we have to consider also other solutions. So we can also in robotics consider a distributed control in order to reduce the complexity of the control itself. And in particular, I would like to show you the results that we obtained investigating the suckers. So we have developed several prototypes also of arms and the robot, but in particular, we are focusing on the suckers that are very interesting from many points of view, since they can adhere, they are, of course, soft, they are muscular hydrostat, they can adhere to any surfaces, also very unstructured surfaces, also in wet condition. And so our idea is to investigate first the anatomy of the octopus suckers. So by using a bioengineering approach, so we use several techniques to investigate and understand the anatomy and the features also in terms of mechanical properties of the material, and then translate, as I mentioned, into an artificial system. But this is also a very interesting example in which we discover some features never described in literature before. So we can see the image of the sucker on the left that is described in the literature before our work. So you can see that there is this dome that is called acetabulum, and the part that is in contact with the substrate is called infundibulum. But the acetabulum was described as completely smooth and without any protuberance. Instead, by using different techniques, we observe this protuberance that you can see here. And we suppose that this protuberance is fundamental in the process of the attachment and detachment of the sucker from the surfaces. Also in the protuberance and also in the infundibulum, we found hierarchical hairs that actually we don't know what is the role. We suppose that is fundamental for the sensing, but we are still ongoing in this investigation, or probably they could also have a role in the attachment in the adhesion process, but actually we don't know. And so you can see here the use of ultrasonographic analysis to demonstrate how the protuberance close, in fact, the operculum during the attachment of the infundibulum. And our hypothesis is that is fundamental to maintain a negative pressure inside the sucker and to maintain attached the system also for a long period without energy consumption. So we use all this information to develop a CAD model, and then we use this 3D reconstruction, so this CAD model, for molding. So we select then artificial materials that have properties quite close to the natural one, and we develop our system that is in fact able to work, to operate in a wet condition, like the natural system. And what is also very interesting are these growth that we add on the infundibulum and the artificial part of the infundibulum, like the natural system. Here, here you can see the natural suckers on the left, and we increase passively more than 30% the adhesion properties of the sucker, just adding this morphology to the artificial system. So this is a very important demonstration how the morphology of our robot, our devices is fundamental also to improve the performance in the real environment. And this is an example of use of these suckers with the octopus arm in a real condition. This was an industrial project. The goal was to retrieve objects from wells with a maximum diameter of 7 centimeters and in presence of high pressure and dirty condition in presence of oil. So the suckers were very useful to retrieve objects object of any shape. So there is a different paradigm in using this kind of robots, because it is the robot that adapts its shape, its morphology to the external environment, the external condition. But there is also another model that we are investigating. This is, the next generation robots that we have developing concerning the octopus. So the goal, the perspective in this kind of project is also sensorizing the suckers in order to have a distributed control, but a localized control like in the natural system. And so with the sensing, the robot can in some way select the better pattern to retrieve the object or to manipulate the object in very complex environment. But there is also another model that we are investigating. In particular, this is another example of muscular hydrostat. This is the elephant trunk. As you probably know, in nature there are a few examples of muscular hydrostat. One are the cephalopod, our arms. Then there is the elephant trunk and our tongue, so the vertebrate tongue. But why elephant trunk is so interesting also in robotics? So this animal use the proboscis to apply stronger force to the environment, but also to manipulate delicate and softer objects. So the idea within this project, the FAT Open project coordinated by my colleague Lucia Beccai, we are involved in the development of new actuators to develop the elephant trunk, the artificial elephant trunk. The idea here is to develop muscle-like geometry-based actuators that can contract or elongate. And so the idea is to generate this contracted unit that can be then assembled for developing a proboscis, so a very complex structure. And by just play with some geometrical parameters like, for example, the ellipses and the pleats of this shape of these actuators, we can obtain three different kind of contractile units. So units that can in particular contract, that are very useful for contraction. In this case, the geometry is narrow ellipses and deep pleats, or can more suitable for an elongation. In this case is shallow pleats, or are both able to contract and elongate. So by tuning these properties. What is also interesting is that completely 3D printable. So we can use also different material, different 3D printer, but also we can play with the design and in particular with the sides. That is particularly useful for developing this kind of conical shape in the elephant trunk or also in the octopus arm. And so you can see some of the performance. In this case, the actuator is in particular suitable, as I said, for the contraction, and is a pneumatic actuator. And we can play with the assembly of these contracted units to, for example, develop not only elephant trunk, but also softer arms that can be used, softer hands, that can be used for manipulation grasping. There is another animals that we are investigating. In this case, as I mentioned, there are particular soft animals. This is another example of invertebrates, earthworms, that we are investigating for developing autonomous robots for soil exploration. And this is quite peculiar animal, since they are completely soft again, but they can play and contract selectively the muscle. So there are antagonistic muscle. There is a cavity inside the body of the animal completely filled with liquid. And so by contracting the circular muscle, the animal is able to elongate. Instead, by contracting the longitudinal muscle, there is a retraction and the contraction and the increase of the stiffness of the animal. So our idea is, as I said, to develop autonomous robot for soil exploration, taking inspiration from this animal. And the idea is to have, in fact, contracted unit and actuator that can both elongate and contract. Again, like in the case of the elephant trunk, the idea is to reduce the complexity, in particular in having different kind of actuator or to control different kind of actuator. In this case, thanks to the arrangement of fibers inside the actuator, we can have both the elongation when there is a positive pressure and contraction when we have, in fact, negative pressure. So by arranging these modules, we can obtain a different configuration of the animals. In particular, we select, so we operate in a medium like air or in soil, and we fill this actuator with different material like gel, water, and air. And what is very interesting is that the gel works very well in a quantity that is around 50-60 milliliter. So you can see also the characteristic of the internal configuration of the actuator. And then we create our software animals that can be controlled selectively, so each module. So in fact, what is very important for moving in soil is, as I said, in particular, to move the initial segment, since in soil, soil can be considered as a very extreme environment where pressure and friction are very high, also in few centimeters of depth. And so the animal, when they move inside the soil, use only the first segment in order to reduce, in fact, the friction and to overcome the pressure. And so we can selectively contract or activate the actuator in order to have a different pattern of the animal inside or on the surface of the soil. But as I mentioned, not only animals, so we are investigating also plants, and in particular, our idea is to take inspiration from plants to investigate their capability of movement, but also distributed control, energy efficiency, and networking. In fact, the plants have a different organization with respect to animals. They have a modular organization. They can grow for the entire life, what is called indeterminate growth. And this is very peculiar since they grow from the apexes, both in the aerial and in the root. And so by growing, they adapt the morphology, they shape continuously to the external environment. And this is exactly the paradigm that we want to introduce in robotics, which is moving by growing. So exactly take inspiration from plants. So as I mentioned, we developed these growing robots, and we developed about 6 years ago the first robot inspired by the plant roots for, again, developing autonomous robot for soil exploration, for agriculture, environmental monitoring, space application, and so on. And by comparing these two guys, so the earthworms that we have just demonstrated on the capability of this animal, but if you compare the earthworm with a plant root, you can see that there are many analogies in terms of adaptation, since also the roots are able to grow, add the new cells from the apexes. So this is the way in which they move. So they, by cell division, they add the new cell at the apex, so the apical region. They absorb water from the environment, and the only part that is pushed in soil into the environment to overcome pressure is the tip, so the apical region. At the apical region, they also have sensing capabilities, so they perceive gravity, humidity, chemicals, so they can avoid obstacles and so on. And there is a behavior associated to these sensing properties that in biology is called tropism, so they can autonomously grow, towards or far from environmental stimuli. So this is why we are taking inspiration from both these guys to developing autonomous robot for soil exploration. And in particular here you can see a schematic view of the root. So there is exactly in the tip that I mentioned what is called a meristematic region, a cell division. So they, as I said, they divide continuously add the mass and then absorb water. And what is also very interesting, analogously to the earthworm, they use hairs. In the earthworm, they use a setae to anchor the structure, to anchor the body to the soil, and in order to be more effective and efficient in soil penetration. So anchoring is an important functionality of the root and also of the earthworm. Taking inspiration from this growing mechanism, we developed the first growing robot by integrating in the tip of the robot a miniaturized 3D printed machine. So there is a motor inside the tip that pulls a thermoplastic filament from a spool. Then this filament is heated in the tip. So we increase the viscosity of the material that becomes sticky and can adhere to the previous layer. So layer by layer, the robot is able to create its own body. So this is the way in which the robot moves and also adapts the shape of the body to the external condition. And the direction growing is given by the sensor integrating the tip. So here you can see also the tip, an enlargement and a zoom on the melting phase. And so in particular, in this case, there are tactile sensor to avoid obstacle, but also humidity sensor, chemical sensor, temperature, gravity, and so on. And you can see an increase of the temperature inside. So the material, as I said, becomes sticky and can adhere to the previous layer. So what is fundamental is that the new layer is in contact with the tip. So this is the way in which we imitate the growing into the robot. So in order to bend, this is fundamental in order to move in a real environment, like in the case of the real root. In order to bend, we have to implement a differential growing. So we needed to implement and deposit more material in one side with respect to the other side. And this is done by selectively control the deposition, for example, controlling the velocity of the deposition, or having a two-way plotting direction. So in both the cases, we have a differential growing, a differential deposition. What is also fundamental is the use of this robot. So our idea is to use, as I mentioned, the robot for soil exploration. In particular, we use it for agriculture, and integrating the tip, temperature and the humidity. The idea is to detect the first centimeter, around 20 to 30 centimeters, with these two parameters that are fundamental also for giving an idea of the stress of the plants, the presence of pathogens, and so on. But also very important, what we did is take inspiration also from the passive morphological adaptation of the root. So the root first adapt passively the body, the morphology to the external condition, and then activate an active response. So in this case, you can see a passive adaptation by exploiting the melting properties of the material. So in this case, there is no sensing, no control, but the robot just purely adapting the shape to the external condition can move effectively in a very extreme environment. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, our goal is also to use this robot for biology. And so by simply comparing two identical systems, one pushed from the top and the other able to grow from the tip, we demonstrated that in the second case, we obtained a faster penetration, more than 40%, and a lower power consumption, more than 70%. So, of course, even if the robot doesn't have the same morphology of material, the natural root, but this is also the role of robotics more and more in the future. So we can really validate some hypotheses by using robots that implement some functionality by taking inspiration from nature. Growing, as I mentioned, is fundamental, but we are taking inspiration not only from roots, but also from climbing plants, in particular the way in which these plants explore the environment without vision. They anchor and sustain the weight, since these plants are quite peculiar. They don't develop a very sophisticated trunk, but they use most of the energy that they have to grow faster with respect to the other plants toward light. So this is a real competition with the other plants. But in fact, to avoid to collapse under their weight, they need to anchor, they needed to sustain. And so by taking inspiration from this capability, the goal is to develop not only growing system, but also implementing such a behavior in the robot, so the capability to explore the environment without a vision, to anchor also the body, and to climb in a very extreme environment. So again, we have this concept of growing robot. In this case, we implement a completely different sensor and behavior, in the sense that the robot has to explore a completely different environment. The robot has to move against gravity. So this is the first big difference. And so perceive the gravitropism, as you can see here, and try to grow, sustaining the weight, but also try to anchor the weight, like in the case of the twining. So you can see that the robot is able to grow around the support like the real plant, in order also to sustain the weight, because otherwise also our robot after a while collapse under the weight. And then of course we can implement the phototropism. This is also very important for many applications, or many other tropism on the base of the sensor, as I mentioned, that we integrate into the tip, into the robot. But it's also very important from our point of view, and this is one of the challenge of this part of the research. So take inspiration also from the capability that these climbing plants have to recognize a support without a vision. So they can perceive for a phase, initial phase of their life, the shadow. So in a mechanism that is called scototropism, they perceive the presence of plant, and then only when they are attached to the plant, they can start to perceive light. So we are implementing the same behavior also in our robot to find a support, as I mentioned, without the use of vision, when the vision cannot be a solution. But also anchoring. This is another feature of these climbing plants. I would like to mention the case of this herbaceous plant, this climbing plant. The name is Gallio apari, and it's a very interesting example of adaptation, since they use hooks on the leaves, on the adaxia and abaxia surfaces, to attach to the leaves of the hosting plant, the parasitic plant, to be better exposed to light. So our idea is to take inspiration from the morphology of these hooks, the mechanical properties of the hooks, like we did for the octopus suckers, and then we reconstruct the shape and the material of these hooks, and we use this CAD model to fabricate a 3D structure of these hooks by using the nanoscribe 3D laser lithography. And we develop an array of these hooks that we can use for many different applications. This is the testing of the hooks. So the first application, the demonstrator that the idea is to use these artificial micro hooks for several applications. One case is developing these micro hooks for climbing plants, climbing robots, sorry. In particular, we attach these micro hooks to this mini car, and we observe that only when the micro hooks are attached to the wheels, the machine is able to climb over a 45-degree inclining plane on different tissue, artificial skin, polyester, loop part of the Velcro, and so on. But our idea is in particular to use such microhooks for developing devices that can be used in precision agriculture. In particular, as you can see, we can attach these devices to the leaves of plants, integrating some sensors, like in this case, humidity, temperature, light. And these are fundamental parameters to understand if there is a stress in plants. And so the idea is actually to intervene on the plants only when is needed. As I mentioned, only having this sustainable agriculture and precision agriculture. This is also another case in which the microhooks are made of material that are biodegradable and can be attached to the leaves, and we can release directly in the tissue different substances, in particular magnesium, potassium, but also other substances directly in the plant. And this is very important also to reduce the use and the abuse also substance in real environment that can contaminate our food and our ecosystem. So this is, again, as I said, for precision agriculture. But I would like also to mention, still from plants, a case of osmosis-based actuator, in which the idea is to take inspiration from this concept, very important in plants. So the plants, of course, are not a muscle, they don't have a muscle, but they can increase the stiffness by playing with the water. And this is the case, in fact, of the osmosis generated by a differential distribution ions in two compartments. And this generates a flux of water from a side with a minor to a side with a major ionic concentration. And so our idea is to develop a forward osmosis-based actuator. We start actually from a simple geometrical and mathematical model, in which we define, by using this model, we define the length scale of the actuator, the time scale, and also the maximum force generated by this actuator. What is very interesting is that we don't need additional electronics or a battery, but we have two chambers, one for the solvent, the other one for the salt, for example, the sodium chloride. Then we have osmotic membrane and bulge membrane to demonstrate how we transform the chemical energy in mechanical energy. And then it's very simple. So the mechanism is triggered by just adding water. And so for osmosis, in fact, we generate a pressure and a force up to 20 Newton in around 2 minutes maximum. So we don't need, in fact, additional battery. As I mentioned, we develop different prototypes in which we can have a faster movement. In particular, like in real plants, we can accelerate the movement by preloading the mechanism, or we can just have a slower movement. Like in this case, we can raise a 2 kilogram bean by just using the bulge membrane. But this system, in fact, is very effective, efficient from an energetic point of view, but it's not reversible, because to make it reversible, the system, we need the pumps, we need the valves, so we lose the effect of this mechanism. So we develop a new system that is a tendril-like soft robot, in which we have still two chambers, but they are completely soft, and we integrate soft electrodes in carbon nanotube inside the soft robot with also osmotic membrane. We can just apply a low voltage, and this way we can absorb and dissolve ions, and we have a consequent movement of the water inside the soft robot. And so the system is able to coil and uncoil around the support. And so, as I mentioned, we can just apply a source is 1.3 3 volts, and this is a very effective, again, from an energetic point of view, but is reversible. Finally, I would like to mention soft body robots, but still take inspiration from movements in plants, in particular passive movement, like in the case of structure that transport the seed into the natural ecosystem. And this is very interesting because these structures are dead, like pines that close or open, or a drilling seed or flying seed. They are dead structure, but they continue to move thanks to the arrangement of the materials inside the cell wall and the other materials that, depending by how they are arranged inside the cell wall, they can interact with, for example, humidity in the environment, or playing the movement, like drilling or flying. So take inspiration from this mechanism. We, in fact, develop this plant-inspired agromorphic actuator, in which we develop this system based on P.PSS, that is the active material that absorbs and desorbs water, and the PDMS, that is the materials that plays the movement, in fact. But since the P dot is also conductive, we can apply low voltage to the system, a current to the system, and then by Joule effect, there is a release of water and a consequent bending of the system. So we can control our artificial devices. So we can play with the shape, but what is fundamental is that this system works as a sensor and actuator at the same time. So we reduce, in fact, the complexity of the control. And now we want to go beyond this system. So this is a quite recent project started this year, in which the goal is to develop an ecosystem of seed-like robots for environmental monitoring. The idea is to take inspiration from drilling seed, like pelargonium or erodium. There are many kind of drilling seed, or flying seed, like the Samara seed. These are made by biodegradable material. These are the first prototype we have developed. Then we integrate some materials that emit fluorescence when interact with some parameters into the environment, like mercury in soil, CO2 in air. So this fluorescence is read by LiDAR techniques on board of drones. And so the system is completely integrated into natural ecosystem. And as I say, the robots are biodegradable. And our idea is to use this robot in real environment for detection of different, as I mentioned, parameters in real condition. But the future is, as I said, take inspiration still from plants and the way in which they communicate each other by interacting with the fungi and create this symbiosis under soil. Our idea is to generate artificial network, what is called Wood Wide Web, actually, to explore the environment, but also to protect the natural ecosystem. So our idea is to take inspiration by this network in soil to develop, as I say, the virtual Wood Wide Web based on the topology and how this topology changes dynamically on the basis of the input, the feedback from the environment, and then develop a next generation of plantoids that not only detect the parameters in soil, but also release a substance in soil to generate and stimulate the creation of this symbiosis. To conclude, this is our vision for the next generation robots. So the idea is, in fact, to have robots that can really interact with the environment, using maybe energy from the environment, growing, acting in real ecosystem, but then at a certain point they disappear because they are made by biodegradable material, like in the case of iSeed, or reusable material. So what is fundamental is also think about the impact of our technology into natural ecosystem and reduce the footprint of our technology, try to integrate the robots into the planet, for the planet. So this is our mission for the next year. And so this is also the topic of the next edition, Robots of 2022, together with Adam Stokes. We are the general chair, and these are the topics of the conference for the next year. So soft robots for the planet, for natural environment, for our welfare. And so the conference will be in April, hopefully in presence, so we will try to see, to do the conference in presence. Hopefully I will see all of you, participating in the conference. And so I would like to thank my colleagues. So what is interesting for me, it's a pleasure to work with them. They come from different disciplines and different backgrounds, so I can learn from them every day. And I would like to thank all of you for your kind attention. Sorry again for the problem. Thank you so much.
So thanks a lot, Barbara, for the very nice presentation.
Thank you.
So we still have some time for questions. So maybe I'll start with some questions from here in Cambridge. So Hujang has a first question for you.
Wait. Thanks for your nice presentation. And I have a question regarding the elongation from the tip, the growing robot. So when you were presenting the performance, it is winding a stick. It is imitation of the natural process of the branch of a plant or something. I was wondering, for the robot, how does it perceive the environment, or it is just a hard-coded process for this?
So thank you so much for the question. So as I mentioned, there is sensors in the tip, so we can detect the environment to this sensor integrated, and there is the controller is integrated in the tip as well. So there is this behavior that is also inspired by the root. So there is a microcontroller integrated in the tip. So there is not analysis at high level, but all the information are analyzed from at the tip level. And so then there is a command from the sensor to the actuators, so to the motor. And so there is a software to implement the differential growing that I mentioned. So what we control actually is the velocity of the deposition of this filament in order to have this bending. So all is integrated in the tip. But you also mentioned about the branching. So this is something that is fundamental in the natural roots, but it's not yet implemented in our system. So we are considering different solutions to have also this branching root. But all, the intelligence, if you want, is all integrated in the single tip.
Thank you.
Still some other questions. There are also some questions online. You can see them in the chat, but I can also read them for you. So first question is, for example, of Davide, sorry. Could we say that the plant-inspired hooks are like micro versions of the hook and loop fasteners, so Velcro tape, but without the need of loop parts?
Exactly. Exactly. This is exactly how they work. So as I mentioned, we implement the angle of these hooks, also the mechanical properties of the material. But like the natural system, they is a sort of racket mechanism, so they can attach and detach when the plant grows, actually. And so we don't need the loop, so we don't need the tissue to attach, but this is why these micro hooks can attach to different substrate, different tissue, also human tissue. In fact, one of the possible applications that we are considering is also in medical application, suturing, or also to release drugs in the tissue. So, but first we are exploiting this idea also for, industrial application in agriculture, as I mentioned. But this is exactly how it works.
Okay, thanks a lot for answering that question. Then there's another question about the hooks. So they look rather sharp. Would the hooks damage the surface that it is climbing on? So, or the leaves?
No, it's actually, again, since they are really inspired by the natural systems, with also some, as I say, that the material also inspired in terms of, they are artificial, but they're very close to the natural one in terms of properties. There is no damage for the natural tissue. But at the same time, they can enter inside the tissue. This is why they are so stable, and they can be used in real application without any damage, like for the natural system, because this plant, as I say, they are parasitic plants, but they need that the hosting plant survive, in fact. So they don't need to damage the hosting plant, because the idea is exactly to cover the surfaces of the hosting plant to be better exposed to the light. So there is no damage for the real plants.
Okay, thanks a lot. I also have another question, but it's maybe a bit futuristic. So you make these robots to investigate the soil, but can you also add sensors to actual plants to start measuring the soil?
Sorry, didn't catch the question. So you say that there is a sensor in the robot, and then what do you
also just have? So the plants, they actually go inside of the soil themselves. So can you actually also attach sensors to the roots of the plants? So real plants.
Yeah, I mean, of course, they are much more effective, efficient, our robot. The problem is how to, in some way, communicate with the real plant and understand what a plant is doing. Since we want to use in a real application, the point is also interact with robot or interact with the plant in order to understand, for example, a contamination in soil or the presence of water. And also, we are starting to measure electrical signal in plants. So this is one of the communication that they use. But of course, the missing part is the information inside the signal that we measure. Like now for the brain, so you measure a spike, but then you have to understand what is the meaning and the information associated to this spike, because they use actual electrical signal to communicate. And so we are starting to measure this signal in the real plants, but we are far from using real plants as a real sensor or robot, real sort of natural robot into a natural ecosystem. So, but you are right, of course, it would be better. And this is one way in the future, maybe, if we are able to communicate or interact with the plants, because they are very, very effective in soil, in air, in many different environments, of course.
Okay, thanks a lot. Are there some other questions here? Yes.
Hello, thank you for the nice talk. I'm just interested in the details of the osmosis actuator. I was wondering if it can actuate, if the actuation is reversible, and if so, how to do it.
As I mentioned in the first version of the actuator, the forward osmosis actuator, in that case, is not reversible, because we don't have a battery, we don't have any components in the system, just the two chambers, the osmotic membrane, the bulging membrane. The system is activated adding water, and then in this way, naturally, forward osmosis, there is a movement. If you want to make this system reversible, and we spend a lot of time to implement such reversibility, in some way you need the valves, because you have to refill the chamber, you have to add the ions, and so you need a lot of components, and so you lose completely the efficiency of the system in terms of energy consumption. And so this actuator can be used only for one shot, for application in which you don't need reversibility. Instead, the other actuator, the other soft robot that I shown, inspired by the tendril, in that case you have a reversibility because it's a controlled mechanism in which we play with the ions by apply a voltage to the system. So we have these electrodes inside the robot. When the voltage is applied, the ions is absorbed by the electrodes, and so there is a consequent movement of water in the side with a major ionic concentration. This is the way in which we can having a movement, a coil and uncoiling, and reversibility in the system. So we need to apply a current to the system.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I look for some other questions. There are also no more questions in. There is another question of yours.
Hi, Barbara. Thank you for the wonderful overview. Very inspiring. I myself am a material scientist, so of course the Bioinspiration is very interesting. I was wondering about the growing robots. There are different types of growing robots, as far as I know. You have the one that you presented that builds itself as it grows, but you also have folded structures and other possibilities, I guess. Is there one that really outperforms all the rest, or could you comment on when you might choose one particular solution over another?
Actually, I just shown the growing system with this 3D printed machine inside. One of the first prototype we developed was based on a version system based on a soft skin with sorry, I have a sorry. It seems that my battery is down, but it's connected. It's very terrible today. I don't know why, sorry. And so we have this version system. Imagine an hollow shaft with a soft skin pulled by metallic cable. And so the mechanism was opening the soil, moving this way. This was very effective because we reduce the external friction with the soil, but move inside the soil, after a while, after a few centimeters in depth, the system collapsed, since we didn't reduce the internal friction of this of such a movement. So the only way to move in soil is by adding new material from the tip. This is why then we move from this growing system layer by layer. And also it's not just an inversion, but we need to add in new material from the tip. The other system could be very useful, for example, in medical application, since you reduce the friction in the external body without damage for the environment. In that case is the human body. So we have some hypotheses and collaboration with some medical doctor for this area, but not for the soil. For the soil, we need to really grow by adding new material. So we demonstrated by using these devices, and in the other case, they are not effective at all in real soil.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for answering also all the questions, and thanks again for the great presentation, Barbara.
Thank you, really. It was a pleasure. And yes, see you soon, hopefully.